This all goes back to starting in 2021. I started to look through and evaluate the annotations and marginalia in Lewis's personal Bibles and theological books. And my thought was that by studying the annotations and marginalia, we could get some window in how he was reading. What was catching his eye? What did he decide to underline or take notes on as he was working through? And I was hoping also to find some correspondences between the passages that received special attention in there and certain things that might show up in his other writing. I had some suspicions that I wanted to potentially verify, and then I just was curious. It's one of those like, let's find out. So I presumed at the time that my training in biblical scholarship and philosophy would also, and classics, would give me some lenses through which to view Lewis's work that wouldn't be always shared by Lewis commentators. Now, what I didn't know at the time, by the way, is that another biblical scholar, Leslie Baines, was doing actually the exact same thing at the same time for a book that she has coming out later this year, and I do think it's going to be worth everybody getting that to plug someone else's book. Now, fortunately, there's so much work left to do on Lewis that we are all going to see and emphasize different things. And the places that Leslie and I ended up arriving at some of the same conclusions and some different ones. We had lunch in November, and we're really pleased, actually. Like, oh, so you went that way with that. I'm going this way with, oh, cool. Well, when did you date the handwriting here? I dated it here. Oh, so did I. So there was a lot of really fun compatibility and some independent verification of some things there. And scholarship can be really amazing in that respect. And what I'm happy to see is that we're starting to see more attention on how Lewis read and used Scripture. And I think that's, you said earlier, yesterday, you said he was really concerned about that more than you say the pagan gods, for example. And I do actually, I find that he incorporates, of course, those things in there, but this is really what's driving the bus. And I think we need to look more closely at that. So, one of the things that I found most interesting, one of the things I discovered is that when I went to look at a lot of these, the annotations that I found in one of his copies of the New Testament, and that's this New Testament, I dated the handwriting to around 1934, 1935 in there, based on Charlie Starr's handwriting analysis of Lewis's letters. His handwriting changed over time, and you can kind of date with some level of accuracy when he's writing based on the formation of certain letters and things. But I dated the handwriting to 34 or 35, and in the Wilson Library, they have this designated as a 1913 edition. When I actually went to get a copy of it, because what I'm actually in the process of doing is actually going through and replicating all of the handwriting, since we're not allowed to copy it, I'm making a copy. So I'm making a copy so that it's as exact as I can make it. And what I found when I bought the exact copy is the copy is actually from 1933, not 1913, as UNC had it marked, which accords pretty well to it being 34-ish handwriting, I think. So anyway, this is a translation that in 1944 he recommended as particularly good among modern translations, and he advised that readers who are essentially new to the New Testament start with something like this one, Moffett. Moffat's translation of the New Testament. And so he's practicing what he advised later readers to do. He said, don't begin with the King James Version. There's been a lot of shifts in the language, and the subtlety and beauty of the language can actually be deceptive at times. Get something that's going to kind of knock you off your expectations. And he recommended this one, which is what he did himself. So he also, I don't think it's an accident that when he began to seriously read the New Testament, this edition is broken into paragraphs that are not versified throughout. The verses are along the side margin. So this is read literarily. You read this and it's punctuated and it's divided more literarily than verse by verse. And I don't think that's an accident, because I think he wanted to do that. That's the sort of thing that he advised. So this, as I said, conveniently for me, because it's at UNC, which is right up the road from me, is housed at the Wilson Library at UNC Chapel Hill, and it's his most heavily annotated Bible. And so we can see with those annotations what he was working through as a new Christian, I think. Now, a few of the annotations I think are actually a little bit later. I think there's some evidence that he went through this more than once over certain years. But a lot of them seem to be from the same, like, few months read through, or sometime pretty quickly. Now, there are a few things, and I'll pass this around if you want to take a look at this particular edition. Take your look through. But I got a question? Oh, okay. Now, a few things that I want to highlight about some of the annotations here. The bulk of the annotations in there, interestingly, and yeah, you went right to the back where I replicated, and I've got on the handout, I've got a copy of that, but I replicated as best I could the index that he put in the back. But the bulk of the annotations, interestingly, come in the epistles and in Revelation rather than the Gospels. Ranked by annotation density, Jude, which is sort of disproportionate just because it's so short, but the rest, the others that were most disproportionately annotated were 1 John, 2 Peter, James, 1 Peter, and Revelation. That's where the bulk of the annotations, the majority of the annotations by volume came from, or a disproportionate amount. Now, of the Pauline epistles, Titus, 2 Timothy, and Ephesians took top billing in terms of the density of annotations. And actually, in the index, you'll see Ephesians has a little X next to it, which seems to mark that he's paying special attention there. Now, some of this is due to greater length of the narrative books, but I think also this is partly due to Lewis' discipline of reading narrative as story. So he's spending less time slowing down and trying to get into the weeds of doctrine, say, a lot of times in the Gospels, whereas in the letters, I think he's reading them a little bit differently. But another thing that I found interesting in here is that it's pretty evident that Lewis kept both his Greek New Testament and a specific commentary. It was a 3-volume commentary that actually there's a 3-in-1 thing that he ended up getting, of Gouge and Guillaume, or I don't know how the third person actually said his name. But I think he kept them close at hand as he read through this translation. And about 15 years later, he actually recommended or he observed that J.B. Phillips, in J.B. Phillips' letters to young churches, he said, this would have been really helpful for me when I was a young Christian. And he recommends that people start with something like that. And this is exactly the time when he was, based on my reading of some of his annotations, he was reading the New Testament together with that commentary at hand to try to work through some tricky things. Now, I want to go through a few of the annotations. I think 4 or 5, I think 5, but 4 for sure, of his annotations, of the written notes that he has in there, specifically reference that commentary. And that commentary he later recommended to Arthur Greaves as probably the best single book of modern comment on the Bible. So that was his recommendation some years later. And a few bits of underlying and marginalia are also on elements that are specifically emphasized in that commentary, and he's got notes in that commentary as well. Not a bunch. Most of those get into there. But all 4 of those annotations are in the epistles. And I think, again, Lewis probably felt less need for commentary in the narrative portions of the New Testament, where I think he felt comfortable as a literary reader to be able to read that and go, I think I know what is being said here. He relied more on his expertise as a reader of stories there. But when he gets out of his expertise, he immediately consults experts, which I think is worth taking note. Now, we're going to go through a few of those passages. We make specific comments and references the commentary first, and then we're going to talk through a couple other things. So this is the first one. Moffett has a footnote in 1 Timothy, between 1 Timothy 3:22 and 3:23, and he's got an asterisk, and then there's a footnote explaining why he's omitted 1 Timothy 3:23 from the translation. And the footnote says this: The words, give up being a total abstainer, take a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent attacks of illness which follow, are either marginal gloss or misplaced. And Lewis underlined that last phrase, either a marginal gloss or misplaced, and then added below, commentary disagrees. And then just moved on. Now the second annotation, referring to the commentary, is Hebrews 4:12, where Moffett's translation says this: the Logos of God is a living thing, active and more cutting than any sword with a double edge, penetrating to the very division of soul and spirit, joints and marrow. Lewis added a footnote for the word soul, and then added a footnote below, where he copies out the Greek from the New Testament, from his Greek New Testament, and says, commentary says this does not mean dividing soul from spirit, but tearing asunder the inmost recesses of soul and spirit. So he's working through some philosophical, cosmological questions here about like, okay, does this divide the soul out from the spirit, or is this a matter of like God dividing the inner person, dividing both soul and spirit themselves individually? And he wants to emphasize to himself on his next reading, this is something to remember. Now, worth noting, here Lewis is engaging directly with the Greek New Testament and the commentary, and he concludes that the language does not require separating soul and spirit as separate things in this particular way. Now, a third reference to the commentary comes in Hebrews 5:9, and here he puts brackets around perfected in the line where it says the Son being thus perfected, and he puts brackets in the text around that. By being thus perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who made him. And then he added the note for the priesthood, right? So now I think that SC there is C commentary, because this is exactly the thing that commentary is emphasizing in this passage, is that the perfection being involved here is that Christ's work perfects him for the work of being the heavenly priest, and so Lewis interprets that way. He actually spends a decent amount of time here on the priesthood stuff, and it turns out when we get to his index in the back, that's what he sees as really central to Hebrews as a whole. So the fourth thing that he looks at in terms of his written annotations and his reference to the commentary is again in Hebrews 9:14, this time where he comments, so this is how much more shall the blood of Christ, who in the spirit of the eternal offered himself as an unblemished sacrifice to God, to cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve a living God. And he adds to that down below, he underlines the Spirit there, and then he adds below diapneumatos ioniou, and then he says the commentary contrasts the psuche, which then he understands as blood. Psuche is usually the word for soul, and he says the psuche is the blood of the goats, etc., with the pneuma, which and that's nomum sacrum. That means it's shorthand for the Lord. It's Latin domum or domus. So with the Spirit which the Lord offered. So again, he's working through some actually fairly rigorous level of distinction here. And this is specifically, again, addressed at some length in the commentary. And there are a few, like I said, there are a few annotations in the commentary, quite a few actually. Interestingly, none of the annotations in the commentary overlap with the things that he puts in the New Testament here. So he either annotates in one or the other, but he doesn't do it in both. Now, a fifth reference to the commentary is here in 1 John 3:19 through 20, where he footnotes the clause, thus it is that we may be sure that we belong to the truth and reassure ourselves whenever our heart condemns us. And he footnotes that with the following. And you see this, emprosen autou peitomen te cardion hemon hoti ean, etc. And then what he does is he takes this and he tries to tease out what this Greek clause means. And you see him here, he says, either, as Moffett seems to take it, if we are acting lovingly, we need not bother about, that is, we shall persuade or quiet the apparent state of our conscience, or, as commentary says, we must act lovingly, our heart or natural egoism will doubtless object that we must persuade it, etc. Neither is very clear in the Greek. And when I went through the Greek myself, I agree. Neither is very clear, and either one is possible. And Lewis is noting this. And I think actually we see him engaging with this question a little bit in Mere Christianity when he starts to talk about some of the questions of assurance. And in a few other places in his writing, he's actually addressing this question. And yeah, it's worth noting that he's trying to get to the bottom of that in this passage, and eventually concludes that it's not easily differentiable in that context. So the Greek is ambiguous and could mean either both. Now, and again, he in other places he addresses the question of one's confidence before God, despite potential misgivings from one's own heart, and he does address that question quite a bit. Now, other active annotations are also involved that don't directly reference the commentaries. So we're going to go through a few of those. And what I mean by active annotations, these are written annotations where he himself makes verbal comments in the margins, usually actually down below the text. So this is one of them, Matthew 1:16. And here he actually correctly observes that Moffett's translation is just wrong. He says in the margin, I can get no such sense from the Greek Yaakov egeneten ton Yosef ton andra Marias ex hes egenete Jesus, which is to whom was born, or Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus. And so he actually, Moffett's translation, he sees this as a problem. In Moffett's translation, this Joseph, the father of Jesus, you can see why he might suddenly investigate that. Like, wait, is this actually saying Joseph is Jesus' begetter? And Lewis goes back to the Greek himself and goes, yeah, Moffett's just wrong here. And he's right. Moffett missed this. In Acts 1 through 4, he keeps a marginal tally. I've got that on another slide, but he keeps a marginal tally going of the number of Christ followers in the Jerusalem church. So in 1:15, he puts the number 120 when there's 120 people gathered in the room. You see in pencil in the margin, 120. In verse 241, where they added 3,000 to their number that day, it says in the margin, 3120. So he's keeping tally of the increase. And then in 4:4, he's 5,000. So he's now up to 5,000. And the number tally stops there, but you can see him as he's reading through Acts, like, okay, let's look at the spread here, which I found interesting. In Romans 9:5, he objects. Let's see if I may have left this one out. It's on your handout, but not up here apparently. He objects to Moffett's rendering. Moffett suggests that a portion of the verse is potentially a later gloss. So this is Moffett puts a part of the verse in parentheses. This is I'll just go off memory here since I don't have it in front of me and on the slide. But this is Romans 9:5 is where Paul says they are Israelites. Theirs are the covenants. Theirs are the service in the tabernacle. And then he finishes off in 9:5 with to whom it also was born the Christ, God blessed for all to all eternity, or blessed above all through all eternity. And there's a long-standing debate about whether or not this should be read as Christ, who is God above all, blessed for all eternity, or Christ, blessed be God for all through all eternity, right? You can read that potentially both ways. Lewis specifically takes a stand here because Moffett clearly brackets that off and says the last part is about God and not about Christ. Lewis complains in his version, I see nothing in the Greek to warrant M's brackets introduced seemingly to prevent St. Paul's asserting Christ to be God. So you see him objecting there based on his own reading. And here we see, interestingly, Lewis' concern with Christology. This is the identity and nature of Christ. And as we'll discuss further below, that's one of the notable patterns that shows up over and over again throughout the annotations of this volume of his New Testament. In Galatians, he underlines the phrase faith active in love, and then he just puts the Greek in the margin. In Hebrews 6:19, he observes our Lord is here identified with the personified hope. See that up there? So, to seize the hope set before us as it enters the inner presence, and he notes the hope is actually Jesus. We see that come out at the end of, that come out in his own writing later on when we get to the end of Till We Have Faces, among other things. In Hebrews 9:9, he interprets Moffett's so long as the first tent, which is foreshadowed in the present age, as, and then he puts in, i.e. pre-Christian religion is the holy outer court, Christianity is the holy of holies inner court. And this observation, which in all honesty here depends on what I think is a mistranslation by Moffett, is closely connected, though, with the myth became fact theme that does run strongly through Lewis' writing and was really important for him in the early 30s. Now, a similar concern is also shown in his footnote on 2 Peter 1:18, where he footnotes the clause, that voice born from heaven we heard, we who were beside him on the sacred hill and thus have gained fresh confirmation of the prophetic word. And he observes, this is either taking bebaioteron, predicatively, translating, and because of seeing the transfiguration, we have the prophecies more assured, or we have a still firmer ground than the transfiguration in prophecy. So either one he sees as possible in the Greek, and he says, but the latter seems impossible in terms of sense. How could prophecy be surer than direct vision? Again, this has to do with the question of historical, whether myth became fact. Are these real eyewitness reports, or is this something else? Now, first, Moffat's translation here, there are a couple of striking things about this particular annotation. Moffat's translation here is such that, in all honesty, if I was reading through this in English, it wouldn't have tripped any alarms for me. I wouldn't have double-checked this myself. It's not something that would have pressed a reader to examine the Greek unless you were reading really carefully and likely with the Greek New Testament on your other knee, something like that. If you're looking at the Greek alongside it as a matter of practice and you're saying, okay, how do these compare? Then you might notice something here. But by and large, this is not something that would necessarily trigger that. And in this case, or if it was something that really involves something of real interest to you, then maybe you double check that for some other reason. But I think in this case, it's probably both. I think Lewis did make a practice of reading his New Testament in English with the Greek New Testament right next to him at hand. And then this theme of eyewitness testimony, again, myth became fact, is important to him. So I think that sort of accounts for that. Now, 3 more brief written annotations remain to be mentioned. I'd already mentioned the Acts 1:16 stuff, or the Acts 1 through 4 stuff, but also in James 4:3 through 4:4, Lewis takes special note of James' rebuke about why prayers are not being answered. And of course, he writes on this more than once, right? Petitionary prayer, a problem without an answer, one of the best titles of anything he wrote. Letters to Malcolm. But here he takes note of that. And this is a verse where it says, you have not because you ask with the wicked intention of spending it on your pleasures, wanton creatures. And here he adds a footnote to wanton, where he observes that the Greek is actually more severe than what Moffett translates, because it really says adulteresses. And he says the God-man relation here is conceived as analogous to marriage, so that worldliness, which comes shortly after that in the next clause, philia tu cosmo, worldliness, love of the world, becomes adultery. Confer the jealousy imagery in verse 5. So he notes here that Moffett's translation is less severe than the Greek term, and notes the additional connotations of marriage inherent there. So I think here it's worthy to recall Lewis' emphasis, sometimes rather startling to 21st century readers, on gender as a significant metaphysical principle of which male and female bodies are only a material manifestation, and humanity he sees as the feminine counterpart of God in that respect. Now, of course, later in his life, Joy Davidman, her riposte after he once praised her for her masculine virtues, forced him to rethink certain implications of this approach, but we do see some of that line of thought here. And the final active annotation is in Revelation 2:2, where he notes from the commentary that the temple of Augustus in Rome was built at Pergamum, which then connects with the mention of the throne of Satan in that passage. So all of this is interesting enough, but the other thing that I really want to highlight here is I found the patterns of underlining and other marginalia even more revealing. In terms of other annotations, Lewis uses a combination of underlining. He underlines a lot, and it's usually the short, pithy phrases that catch him that he underlines. He doesn't tend to underline long passages. And then he uses vertical line in the margin or a double vertical line in certain places where he wants to emphasize it. So in the patterns of what he annotates, I found really fascinating. So we're gonna go through a few of these patterns. Number one, throughout the Gospels and wherever it appears elsewhere, Lewis pays very close attention to any verse or passage that has implications about Christology. That is the identity, nature, and character of Jesus. If it's in the passage, he will find it and he will underline it, or he will put a marginal line there. So Matthew 1:16, which we already saw, pertains to the virgin birth. Other annotations that are along these lines are like Mark 3:12, you are the Son of God, when the demon is being cast out. John 5:19-29, 10 verses on Jesus' dependence and equality with God the Father. He's got marginal note there. He's got a marginal line. Philippians 2:7, emptied himself, underlined. Colossians 1:15-16, he is the likeness of the unseen God, born first before all the creation. And it became, you could make this a parlor game looking through Lewis' annotations at a certain point. I found that as I was going into certain passages, as I was going to flip the page, it's like, I bet you he's going to underline this, this, and this. And more often than not, after a certain point, the patterns actually hold up. Certain stuff just catches his eye, and that's one of them, is Christology. Now, this is hardly surprising, given Lewis' actual observations later and advice about reading the Gospels. In a 1940 letter, he confesses that he initially disliked the Jesus that he found in the Gospels until he shifted his perspective as a reader. Whereas initially he'd read from the judge's chair to assess Jesus so that he would find, oh yeah, you can't not love Jesus. He's like, I found that I didn't like him. But, he says, the first thing, he says, he eventually came to realize that the Gospels are not written to allow you to read from such a standpoint. He says, instead, the first thing you really find is that we are not invited, so to speak, to pass any moral judgment on him. He is going to do whatever judging there is. It is we who are being judged. The first real work of the Gospels on a fresh reader and ought to be to raise very acutely the question, who or what is this? This is precisely what Lewis' own annotations from shortly after his own conversion show him doing. So it shouldn't be surprising. He's grappling with the question of Christology. Who or what is Jesus? And he also, by the way, in the same letter, recommends it's a good idea to try the New Testament in some other language or in Moffett's modern translation. His recommendations are reflections of his own practice. Now, a second pattern that emerges in these other annotations is that Lewis was disproportionately likely to take note of passages involving what might be called apocalyptic or cosmic conflict themes. So casting out evil spirits, demon possession, the spirits in prison in 2 Peter. I'll go through a whole list. The demons identifying Jesus as Son of God. Satan claiming the right to sift the disciples like wheat. The allegation that Jesus himself had an unclean spirit. A woman bound by Satan for all these 18 years. People turning from the power of Satan to God. The spiritual armor of Ephesians 10 through 18. The dethroned powers who rule this world in 1 Corinthians 2:6. Handing a man over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh in 1 Corinthians 5:5. Christians eventually judging angels. Warnings against scoffing at the angelic glories, and Jesus preaching to the imprisoned spirits, and the gospel being preached to the dead. All of these things have specific annotations with them. And it's a pattern that shows up over and over and over and over again. By the way, the gospel being preached to the dead gets the rare distinction of a double marginal line and underlining, by the way. There are only a few passages that have that. He consistently also pays close attention to passages pertaining to eschatology or the end times. I was actually surprised by this. I was going through, I was like, wow, he's got a lot of this. Like, if it's mentioning something about the end times, he's paying extra attention. Revelation is one of the most thoroughly annotated books in the New Testament, and the end times material gets attention everywhere. Mark 13:32, no one knows the day or hour. 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 Peter 3, all of which are annotated in various ways. And then, of course, in the back of his New Testament, he has an entire index outlining the narrative of Revelation. So he's paying attention here. And this attention and openness to the beyond material aspect, right? I wouldn't say supernatural, but beyond nature aspect, and the spiritual or cosmic aspect of the New Testament, I think sets Lewis apart from a lot of modern contemporary biblical scholars. Many of us, even if we are believers, have a tendency to read as quasi-materialists, or as at least soft materialists, as it were. I'm reminded here of a recent book on Pauline theology that arrives at the surprising conclusion that for Paul and his churches, theology and economics are thoroughly intertwined, such that they think of God as having economic agency. Of course, I'm thinking, yeah. That shouldn't be that surprising. But Lewis reads very much differently from this. And even many of us, like I said, who do read as believers, bring a hard monotheism such that God is so sovereign that he's essentially the only actor in an otherwise materialistic context. Lewis, on the other hand, reads very much he reads very much closely the passages about spiritual opposition and the opposing powers of darkness, which a lot of modern biblical scholars tend to read metaphorically rather than about actual spiritual or cosmic powers. But if we take seriously the world rulers of this darkness and spiritual entities of evil in the heavenlies, of which Paul speaks, it changes the way we have to read everything else. And Lewis very plainly took this seriously. And Tolkien actually, in a late letter, noted how dualistic Lewis' mind and imagination were, though as a philosopher, he rejected this, Tolkien says. But in his imagination, he read very much this way, and he thought very much in this way of this kind of cosmic dualism. And I think you can see that in how he's reading the New Testament. Now, I think also this shouldn't be surprising because this also reflects at least two other important emphases throughout Lewis' work. And the first is perhaps his most frequently repeated refrain about reading and about literature. And that's that the first step for any good reader is an imaginative and intellectual surrender to the text and its contextual world. So he explains in a preface to Paradise Lost that you must, insofar as you lie, as it is possible, become an Achaean chief when reading Homer, a medieval knight when reading Mallory, an 18th century Londoner when reading Johnson. Only thus will you be able to judge the work in the same spirit its author writ and to avoid chimerical criticism. We see the same approach as early as a 1916 letter to Arthur Greaves, where he says, if you're to enjoy Beowulf, you must forget your previous ideas of what a book should be and try to put yourself back in the position of the people for whom it was first made. Now, he wrote this long before arriving at another insight that added gravity to that word enjoy, which means that this letter carries the ordinary meaning, in this letter it's carrying the ordinary meaning of finding delight or pleasure in something. But decades later, he divided things into two distinct types of conscious thought. First is the enjoyed, and second is the contemplated. The distinction is between experience and introspection. In order to be a good reader, he says, you have to experience the text first. Only later do you step back and think about think about the thinking about it. You have to experience it and you have to feel it first. You have to step into the world and try it on, kind of like David trying on Saul's armor. Even if you put it off later, you at least know what it feels like. And Lewis is doing that throughout his approach to the New Testament. So this is, I think, one of the things, and I'm going to skip a few things here to deal with, but the second thing the second emphasis that he's getting at here has to do with looking at the beam versus along the beam. This famous episode, this famous essay of Meditations in a Tool Shed, he talks about how studying the light itself and seeing the bits of dust in it, it's one thing. It's another thing to turn so that you're seeing along it. In reading, he actually argues that you have to step into line with the worldview, with the perspective of the text to be able to enjoy it, to look along the beam in the way that the author and the original readers would have been likely to be thinking. And then, only then can you really get meaning out of this. And then he argues that, well, if you decide that the meaning is wrong rationally later, that's one thing, but you can't assess it well until you've done that. And again, I think we see that emphasis in how he actually annotates a lot of these passages and his attention to things that a lot of modern biblical readers just, they kind of gloss over, they metaphorize, and I don't think he's doing that. So I'm going to skip over some of the more philosophical oriented material here. But the other side to this, by the way, is that I think he also is taking he's taking a different angle from modern readers, in that I think he sees there being this being a right way to read the text, as opposed to there being any number of ways of reading the text. That you have to step into line with the text itself first. So we'll skip over a few other things as I'm running a little bit short. So we'll move on to that. But I think the general aim here is Lewis manifestly aims to inhabit the world of what he's reading and tries to feel as if he shared the same presumptions and the cosmic models as the text he's reading. And he argues that the approach to this is to have something done to us, not that we may do things with it. The first demand any work of art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive, get yourself out of the way. He argues that this humble and receptive interpretive approach is ultimately an outworking of love, since in love we escape from ourself into one another. So since good reading requires love, through which we learn to subject ourselves to be affected and impacted by another through the text, this actually is a manifestation of another thing we talked about yesterday, which is the principle of dying to live. He actually concludes this passage in Experiment in Criticism with, this is the age-old paradox of you must first lose your life in order to find it. And what he finds is in this way of submissively approaching reading is the only way to really encounter another, and only way to really be impacted, to be changed in any way by reading. And what's interesting is how much this contrasts with modern scholarly approaches, where many of my colleagues, and I actually there was a recent review of my second book where I was dinged for arguing that there are right and wrong interpretations. Because this sounds like the ancient times when people thought that we could assess, that we could actually find some sort of truth or right interpretation. But now we know that, your perspective determines what you're going to get out of a text. Lewis argues vociferously the opposite. He says you can come to a text that way if you're coming to the text to use it. But if you come to the text to be impacted and affected, then the text can change you. And that's how he's reading, I think. You can see that by, again, the attention to the cosmic stuff. Last thing that we're going to look at here is, and this is the final thing that I want to highlight here. Actually, one last thing before I get to that last thing. That this principle, which Lewis underlines or otherwise annotates in nearly every place it appears, so this principle of dying to live, losing oneself to find oneself, emptying oneself to be filled, becoming like a child to enter into the kingdom, that this principle is so necessary, Lewis argues, to being a good reader, I think is something else that ends up being foundational for Lewis to recognize the fundamental truth of Christianity, where this idea is so central. It confirms to him that the New Testament is properly attuned to the code written into the cosmos. As he famously said, only by coming into alignment with Christianity could he see everything else. So, the final major theme that I identified in Lewis' annotations is perhaps the most consistent and the most important of all. So I do want to make sure I get this in. And this is the parlor game you can absolutely play with him when you're looking through his annotations. In this Moffett New Testament, if there is a passage that marks out a moral imperative or moral instruction or a passage about giving, you can rest assured it's almost certain that he's going to underline it or put some note there. He's reading very much in the mode of, what am I supposed to do? What demand does this put on me? So where it says, sell everything you have and give to the poor, that's noted, right? So, I was surprised to discover less annotation in, for example, the passage about soteriology, the plan of salvation passages. But in Romans, he has more notes in James than he does there. In James, he pays special attention to the passages on temptation, bridling the tongue, taking care of widows and orphans, avoiding presuppositions and boasting about the future and confessing sins to one another. The entire chapter of James 3, which is about don't be too eager to be a teacher. Not many of you should be teachers. The entire chapter is a marginal line to draw his attention back to that. And it became predictable. Whenever there was a passage about how a person should behave, Lewis would mark it. Passages warning about hypocrisy, marked. Passages warning about sinning with one's mouth, such as the mouth utters whatever the heart is full of, underlined. Sell what you possess, give it away in alms, underlined. If your right eye is a hindrance to you, underlined. Unless you repent, all of you will perish, underlined. Use mammon, dishonest as it is, to make friends for yourselves, underlined. You who are strong ought to bear the burdens that the weak make for themselves and us, underlined. He who sows to his flesh will reap destruction from the flesh, underlined. The fruit of the Spirit, marginal line. Set your mind on things above, underlined. The first duty of religion is to their own household, underlined and a marginal line. Over and over again, he's marking specific practical behavioral teachings. This is a man reading not to learn about the mechanisms of salvation, but a man looking to remind himself of his obligations and how he's supposed to live now that he has settled that Christ is Lord of his life. This stands out to me as a remarkably submissive way of reading the text. In contrast to so much modern scholarship where the modern critic sits in judgment over the text, Lewis submits himself to the judgment of the text. It's so much easier to read from one's own perspective and embrace one's agency in the interpretive process. It's a lot more difficult to submit oneself and do the work necessary to meet the text, whether the Bible or any other literature, on its own terms rather than ours. But this is one area where I think Lewis is strongest as an example, both advising and setting an example of what I'm calling the art of gentle reading. Now up here, just the last thing, and in your handouts, and I think everybody may have gotten one this morning, you can see Lewis notes. This is the little index he has in the back there. And you can see right up here where he's got Romans. This is the Sterben würde. This is the die so that you may become from Goethe. You've got some of my favorites here. You've got James, keep your mouth shut and your ears open. That is his summary of the Epistle of James, right? You have Ephesians, the new man, fatherhood, panoply. You have 1 Corinthians, the Spirit, charity, resurrection. You have Revelation carved out on the back flyleaf. You've got a few other notes that I think came from a little bit later. But you can see how he's working here. And I find this really, really fascinating. And you can see also sort of the gift for brevity and pithy statements in ways that I think are really worthwhile. So I've gone over time, so I don't want to take any longer, but very much happy to get to share a little bit of this work in progress. And I hope you find this as fascinating as I do. I think he sets a really interesting example as a reader, but thank you. That is not his actual writing. That is the best I could do in about an hour and a half to replicate the writing and imitate certain features of it, including certain F's and things that are important for dating his handwriting. But I did this because you can't make a copy of it, so I did it just so that I could project it. So thank you all.
Again, I'm William O'Flaherty. My podcast, All About Jack, has been around since 2011. My more recent YouTube channel is called Knowing and Understanding C.S. Lewis. Finally, everything I do related to Lewis is centralized at the website essentialcslewis.com. And in case you didn't know, I've written 2 Lewis-themed books. The Misquotable C.S. Lewis was released in 2018. It examines 75 quotations credited to him that he either didn't write or paraphrases of something he did or without the context could be misunderstood. In 2016, my enhanced study guide to the Screwtape Letters came out. It's called C.S. Lewis Goes to Hell. Thanks again for listening, and please consider liking and sharing this episode with others.